Okay, so we know what we need to do for middling. We need to figure out the probabilities, we need to figure out the bet sizes. One of the most important things we need to think about is the value of each point that we're getting in the middle. If you get a 2-point middle or a 3-point middle, how much is that worth? Let's start that discussion by thinking about NFL spreads. So continuing from the previous section, remember, a middle only exists when it's possible to take two sides of a bet at different books in a way that guarantees at least one of them wins. The middle hits if both sides win. Okay. Now we had this example where the Patriots were plus 7.5 and the Jets were minus 6.5. And here we saw that the break-even probability was 4.8%, meaning we had to have the Jets win by exactly 7 points at least 4.8% of the time. Remember, anything can happen in any particular game. They can win by 20, they can lose by 20. Overall, we're going to be betting this many times, similar sorts of things many times. If our estimate of the probability of this relatively rare event happening is, on average, continuously, cumulatively correct, if we're often right about it being more than 4.8% or whatever the relevant break-even probability will be, that's when we'll start to make money. So it's critically important that we have a middle probability that makes sense to us, that we believe, and presumably it's above 4.8%, in which case we would want to bet this. If it's less, we simply don't bet. How do we figure out this middle probability? And how do we figure out the right bet sizes? Let's start with the middling probability. What is that probability? How do we ask it? How do we figure? So the question we want to ask is, how likely is it to be 7? What's it? How likely are the Jets to win by exactly 7? Well, we don't know the future. We have the past. What can we use from the past to try to estimate this probability? It seems like we have a very specific, clear question, but actually we don't. There's lots of different ways of answering this question. For example, you can ask, well, how often historically have the Jets won by exactly 7? You could look back at one season, you could look back 20 seasons and see of all the games that the Jets played, how many ended with them victorious and winning by exactly 7 points. That is a question that you could ask, and that's a question that you could answer with using just historical information about box scores and previous games. You can answer that question, but is that the right question? Why the Jets? What about the opponents? Should we also ask, or separately ask, what about the Patriots of all their games over the past season, 20 seasons? How many times have they played a game where they lost by exactly 7? And you can start to see some of the issues that come up when trying to figure out these important numbers, these probabilities. Are the Patriots 20 years ago, the Jets 20 years ago, are they the same teams as they are now? And why are we only looking at one side? Just the Jets, just the Patriots? Shouldn't there be some sort of interaction? Ideally, we'd like to see how many times when the Jets played against the Patriots in exactly the same conditions as we're viewing now. How often? But that's so rare. Maybe we want to expand the question we're asking. Not just how many times have the Jets won by exactly 7? Because who are the Jets? The Jets are just a NFL team. Why don't we look at all NFL teams? How often has any team won by exactly 7? Maybe that's a different kind of question. It's certainly a different number. Which one of them is a better number? Well, if the Jets are at home, maybe we want to ask, how often has any home team won by exactly 7? That kind of narrows it down closer to the situation that we're considering. Well, the Jets are also the favorites. Maybe we want to ask, how often has the favorite won by exactly 7? Or most specifically, maybe we want to ask, how often has a favorite, a 7-point favorite, won by exactly 7? The way we're going to answer these questions is, we sometimes call it an empirical distribution. Empirical means something you can touch. It just means from the historical data. These are often plotted in what are called histograms. Histogram sounds like it relates to history or something. It doesn't really. It just means vertical bars. So what are we having here? Let's look at some dice. If we're tossing dice, And each time we toss a dice, each one of them could be 1 through 6 and 1 through 6, we take the sum. We'd like to know, what does the distribution of the sum of these two dice look like? So every time we roll a dice, like say we roll a 1 and a 4, that adds up to 5, so we add something to the 5 column, right? Every time you get a 2, you add to the 2 column. And it just keeps coming up, right? So you're just putting up a count. This happened, you put a mark over here. And the size of the bar vertically just indicates how often it happened. Maybe relative to all the others, but just how often it happened. So we can see that the most likely outcome is a 7. And getting a 2 or a 12 is very unlikely. This is called a histogram. And it's a very convenient way of looking and summarizing the historical situation. Now, we don't care about dice, but imagine if we had games, and every time a particular team won by a particular score, that was one of the buckets, and then we just look at all the games, and every time it finishes in a particular bucket, we add a little marble to it. That's how it's growing here. So let's try some of our questions. Over the past 5 seasons, how many times have the Jets won by exactly 7 points of all the games they played? So in 5 years, they played 64 games. Of all those games, they won by exactly 7 points, exactly 2 times. So that's 3.13%. Now let's spend a little bit of time on this graph to make sure we totally understand it. What are these numbers here? Now, when the Jets win by 7, you could call that, what do you want to call that bucket? Do you want to call that bucket plus 7 or minus 7? This is a decision you have to make before you start plotting the data. I decided to call it minus 7. Why? Because the spread of the Jets was minus 7. And I would like a number that is analogous to that, so I don't have to do mental gymnastics in my head converting positive to negative. The spread was minus 7. How many times was the outcome exactly what the spread predicted? In other words, negative 7. So to do this, you take the score of the Jets, how many points they scored, and the score of their opponents, and you subtract it in such a way that it's negative if the Jets are winning. So you take the opponents minus the Jets in all of these games. So if the opponents scored 20 points and the Jets scored 27, this would be 20 minus 27. That would be a negative 7 bucket. We add a little marble there. Let's look at the next game. Oh, here the Jets won by 32 points or whatever that bucket is. Okay, we add a marble there. The Jets lost by 20 points. We put it in the plus 20 bucket. And so over time, over the 64 games, every single line here, every game is now represented in this histogram. And we see that out of the 64, twice they won by exactly 7. Okay, let's try some of our other questions. What about if we ignore the Jets and just look at the Patriots? In their last 5 years, they had 73 games. Out of those 73 games, how many times did they lose by exactly 7? In other words, opponents minus Patriots was plus 7. The opponents outscored them by 7 because the spread in the case that we're looking at is also plus 7. Again, we want to kind of match it. That happened 4 times out of the 73. So 4 divided by 73 is 5.48%. That's a slightly different number. We're ranging now from 3 to 5%. Which one is correct? Both of them, both of the questions we've asked so far have only looked at one side, right? Just all Jets games, just all Patriots games, right? No consideration for the interaction of the two. What if we ask it different? Expand the question, not just the Jets and not just the Patriots. Of all the games that were played in the 5 years, which is 1,000 times, 1,070 times, of all those games, how many were games such that one team beat the other by exactly 7 points? So if you define this in terms of the home team, there will be a negative 7, there will be a plus 7. We care about both of those. 90 times it happened that exactly one team, well, obviously one team, beat the other by 7 points. That happened 90 times. 90 divided by 1,070 is 8.41%. Look at the range we have, something from 3% up to 8% now. Okay. The next question we thought about asking was, well, what about just the home team? Just the home team wins by exactly 7 points 5.33% of the time. All right, that's another number we can get. We also asked, what about the favorite? How often did the favorite win by exactly 7 points? That happened 5.51% of the time. Okay, there we go. That's the green bar. What about not just the favorite, but the 7-point favorite? So a team is favored to win by 7 points. How often does it exactly win by 7 points? That happens 7 times out of 84, so about 8%. What if we extend that though? Because we don't care about exactly 7. Here we're looking at a middle where one line says 6.5, another says 7.5. Why don't we look at all teams where there was a 6.5, 7, or 7.5 point favorite? And of all those games, how many won by exactly 7 points? Well, 185 times that situation happened historically over the past 5 seasons. And out of those 185, 11 times the 6.5 to 7.5 point favorite did in fact win by precisely 7 points. So that's 5.95%. Let's summarize everything we've seen. We have all of these numbers on the right. We answered all these questions. We even asked an additional question at the bottom, extending not just the 7 point precisely, but 6.5 to 7.5. And we have numbers ranging from 3% up to 8 point something percent. Which of these numbers do we want to say is our representation of what we think that the probability will be that this particular game, the Jets will beat the Patriots by 7? Probably the best one is the last one. What is the class of games that are similar to the ones we're looking at? Well, it's a game where there is a favorite, and that favorite is somewhere between 6.5 to 7.5. That's probably the universe that's best comparable to the situation we're facing here. In those situations, it happened 185 times. Of those 11 times, we actually won with the middle hit, and that's a 5.95%. Remember, the break-even probability was 4.8%. So 5.95% is higher. That's good. That means if we believe these numbers, that the middle is likely to hit more frequently than it needs to in order for us to make money. Well, what's our edge? Remember our formula. It's the middle probability times the decimal odds minus 1. Well, what are the decimal odds here? We know it from the bet. We're risking $50, right, if the middle doesn't hit from one side or the other, and for a chance to win 1,000 if it does. So those are decimal odds of 21. If we believe our 5.95% probability, then our edge is 595 times 21 minus 1. That's a 24.95% edge. It's great. That's a 25% edge. So what's our EV? Our stake is $50, right? Multiply that by the edge, we have $12.48. Sounds reasonable. You're putting up $50. You expect in the long run to win $12.48. And of course, if you scale that up to the extent you can, you just keep adding zeros. Okay. But we do want to ask a question about this. How stable is this number? Now, we looked at the past several seasons, but what if we just break it down to 4 seasons? Is it consistent? Well, let's see. In 2016 to 2017, there were 41 games, and they won 4 times, so it was 9.76%. The second year is 455, third year 682, last year 357. So it can vary, can't it? If it ends up being 357, if that's the real, in whatever sense that means we say true or real probability, if the probability of winning by exactly 7 points is 3.57, which is less than our break even, 4.8, we're going to lose money, right? We're taking some sort of faith that the probability that the 7 hits is larger. Maybe it's 595, if so the EV is very high, but at least above 4.8, so we make money. So there's some sort of risk here involving our own estimates of how likely the middle is to hit. So let's look at some robustness measures of this thing. here's what we had before, right? So we had the 595. But what if it wasn't 595? What if it was 541? Right? If it was just one less. If it was one less game, one less win. Now we're suddenly down to our edge is cut in half to 1361, and our EV is down in half also to 676. And if it goes down by one more, it's 486. Now our EV is just $1. Our edge is just 2%. This is the risk, right? We don't know, we'll never know the true probability. There's no such thing as a true probability, but we know we have an exposure to the risk of our probability being wrong.